The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please, come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "See how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid. Just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and he entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I think it's difficult to imagine anything more painful than a dying child. Such an experience causes perhaps the greatest anguish possible for parents. A father and a mother will go anywhere, do anything, try anything in a desperate attempt to save their child. In my years as a priest, I've spent quite a few days and nights in hospital wards with the desperate parents of very sick or critically injured sons or daughters. In their anxiety and pain, we've prayed together in hospital chapels. We've eaten together in empty cafeterias in the middle of the night. We've sat together quietly in waiting areas. Some children lived, but some died. The death of a child, no matter what age, is crushing for any parents. Children or younger men and women are supposed to die, we tell ourselves, in old age, not before they are teenagers or while they are in high school or college, not before they have had the opportunity to live a long life, as most people do. In the end, there is no easy answer to the question, why? Why do some live and others die so young? In our gospel this morning, Jairus, the synagogue official, did not care about when people were supposed to die. All he knew and cared about was that his 12-year-old daughter was dying. And in the midst of his pain and anguish, he turned to Jesus, his last hope. The story of Jairus and his critically ill daughter is interrupted, however, by another story about a woman with a hemorrhage who suffered from external bleeding due to damaged blood vessels. After a dozen years with the best medical treatment known at the time, the woman had not only exhausted her financial resources without any sort of improvement, but her condition had actually grown steadily worse. 12 years is a long time to be ill, and getting worse is disheartening. What made the woman's condition even more frustrating at the time was that her disease rendered her, in the eyes of her fellow Jews, ritually unclean. She was considered, therefore, an outcast. She was to have no dealings with family or friends. She could neither socialize with them nor worship with them. Like Jairus, the woman also approaches Jesus, but unlike Jairus, does not ask for help. She seeks only to touch the garment of Jesus in the hope of being healed. She knows that if she actually touched Jesus, he would, according to the law, also be made unclean. And so she touches only his garment. And Jesus feels power from him flowing forth and knows immediately that someone had been healed. There are differences, of course, in the two stories, but striking similarities as well. Jairus, a religious leader, and the woman with the hemorrhage come from opposite ends of the social and religious spectrum of the community. Jairus is named while the woman remains unnamed. Jairus is a synagogue official, but the woman is not even permitted to enter the synagogue. Jesus goes to Jairus' house, but does not have to touch his daughter to raise her to life, whereas the woman with the hemorrhage touches Jesus' garments to be healed. But these differences are of little significance in light of what Jairus and the woman have in common. Both approach Jesus in faith and trust. Additionally, for the gospel writer St. Mark, much more than physical healing takes place in the woman and the dead child. There is spiritual healing as well. To the woman, Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Her humiliating illness is finally over, as is her chronic state of ritual impurity. And for the healing of the daughter of Jairus, Jesus tells her father, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." St. Mark recounts that at Jesus' words, this little girl, who at this point had died, arose immediately. Arose, the term used of Jesus' own resurrection. Yes, the little girl arose to new life. Both she and the woman are saved, not just in the sense of being physically healed, but in a deeper sense of beginning a new life, of finding peace with God. Now, both of these stories have happy endings. But we know, and perhaps you have personally experienced, similar stories, similar tragic circumstances, which have had very different endings. Perhaps your experience tragically has been the untimely death of a young son or daughter, a brother or a sister, a friend. Or perhaps your experience has been the long, extended illness and suffering of a spouse, an elderly relative, a grandfather, a grandmother. There are no easy answers to the question why some live and others die, why some suffer for an extended period of time and others do not. And if our prayers are not answered as we would like, Jesus asks of us no more and no less than what he asked of Jairus and the woman with the hemorrhage. Have faith and trust. Faith in his promise of eternal life and peace, and trust that his grace will help us bear whatever cross we may have to bear, trusting that in time he will heal and renew us, and that we will be able to move on with our lives, strengthened in a special way by the example of Our Lady of Sorrows, Mary, who experienced the death of her only son, yet remained a woman of faith and trust.